Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Pynakker, and before we get started with this really interesting guest, I just want to do a little housekeeping here. I just want to announce that the October book giveaway is The Burning Book by Jason Olson and James Goldberg, a Jewish Mormon memoir. And this is by Common Consent Press, which, by the way, my guest is actually kind of like the founder of. And they sent me an extra copy to give away this month. Now, of course, many of you are close on 35,000 views for this interview I did with Jason a little over a month ago. And I've been hearing from a lot of people who've been buying the book, whether it's a hard copy or they're doing the Kindles or whatever, and they're just loving this book. And so they were so kind to send me an extra copy to give away. So in the description is my email address, mormonbookreviews@gmail.com. And in the subject line, put in October book drawing and give me your name and address. I'm very excited about this guest I have on today. His name is Michael Austin, and he's a man who wears many hats. He is a provost, the newly installed provost of Snow College in Utah. But he's also been a provost at a Methodist university, at a Catholic university, and he also is active in the Mormon scholarly community. Also, he's the publisher. He's one of the founders of this press. So I got to know Michael a little bit the other day and had a wonderful conversation with him and asked him to come on my program because he has a really interesting story to tell. This episode is going to be kind of an introduction to my audience of Michael and the work that he does. He's got this fantastic book that's coming out next January. This weekend, depending on when this is taped, it'll be before or after. This weekend, he'll be presenting at the Book of Mormon Studies Association, which my good friend Christopher Thomas, Dr. Christopher Thomas, author of the book, A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon, is the president of. And rumor has it this might be his last year as the president. And I really wish I could be there because all my homies are going to be there, including this guy, Michael Austin. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you very much, Steve.
So I wanted to maybe just you give a little background on yourself. And when I say background, like, let's go to the beginning. Tell us about you growing up. Where did you grow up? Where were you born? Were you born in the covenant? Did you serve a mission because you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Kind of give us just a little brief background.
Okay. So, yes, I was born in Provo, Utah. My parents were attending BYU as a member of the church. So yes, I was born in the covenant. When I was 1, we moved to Southern California. My father was a trust banker. And then when I was 7, we moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I spent the rest of my life growing up in Oklahoma, in several different cities and communities in Oklahoma. At 18, I returned to BYU and did 1 year in 1984 to 85, and then I served a mission to the Fresno, California mission, Spanish speaking. So dealt with largely the immigrant population there. Then I went back, finished my bachelor's and my master's degree at BYU, both in English. And then I went to the University of California at Santa Barbara for my doctorate. And so that took me until 1997. I specialized in the literature of the Restoration, but not the Restoration that we're talking about here, the Restoration of Charles II,
Okay.
which happened in 1660 after the Cromwell interregnum. Charles II came in from France and brought with him a lot of French ideas about literature and art. So there was kind of this explosion of literature from 1660 to 1700 that's called the Restoration. So my academic work is with a very different restoration. But also when I was in graduate school, I wrote a little article about trying to find Mormon literature. It was called The Function of Mormon Literature at the Present Time. Actually, it was originally called How to Be a Mormo-American, but Dialogue found that not a very good title. So I published that in Dialogue. It actually was awarded the Association for Mormon Letters Award for Criticism that year. And that was just kind of my anchor and my foundation in Mormon literary studies, which at the time was actually a larger community than it is now, because there were a lot of BYU professors who were studying Mormon literature. So that's Eugene England, Richard Craycroft, Bruce Jorgensen, Ed Geary, Neil Lambert, all of these professors were publishing regularly in peer-reviewed journals about Mormonism and literature. And there are lots of reasons why that's not happening at BYU anymore. That's not my story to tell.
Okay.
But that was sort of the community that I had my toe in. Most of the early part of my career, I started teaching British and world literature at Shepherd College in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I applied for about 75 jobs in 18th century and restoration British literature. I got one of them. It was in West Virginia. So we moved there, and I spent 11 years at Shepherd, really formative years for me, because I taught so much and I taught so many different things. It was a small college. I was a generalist, so I taught Dante, and I taught Homer, and I taught all sorts of world literature and all kinds of British literature classes, and really kind of read a lot. I had to read a lot in order to teach. I became the chair of the English department there after 3 years, and that was I was the only untenured member of the English department and ended up the chair because nobody else wanted to do it. And that was the beginning of my administrative career.
Okay.
4 years later, Shepherd College received permission from the state to become Shepherd University, and I was asked to be the first graduate dean.
Okay.
And there were no graduate programs to be dean of. My job was to create them.
Okay.
So really, I spent 4 years in program development, developing 5 master's degree programs that were our first graduate programs, including an MBA, a music master's degree, a Master of Arts in Teaching, a Master in College Student Development. And then after that, my provost set me down and said, Mike, you're ready to be a provost. Why don't you start applying for provost positions? So I did. I applied for a provost position in Wichita.
So just real quick, I want you to what is a provost, and why did this person think, one, that you're qualified for it, and what is a provost?
So a provost is another name for the vice president for academic affairs,
okay,
and it's usually the second in command at a university. Normally, the president faces outwards, and the provost handles most of what happens inside on the campus. Presidents, especially in private universities, that's primarily a fundraising position, not an academic administration position. Actually, the provost is a fairly new title. It used to just be called the dean of the college. And if you look at old movies, there's always a dean. Well, as colleges became more complicated, there was a title inflation in the office of dean. So there were a lot of different deans. So they had to come up with a word for what used to be the dean, because there are so many deans now. So who is this person who's in charge of all of the academic programs and the curriculum? And the word provost is actually a fascinating word because it originally meant jail keeper. And there's a character in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, Provost, who his job is to bring severed heads to the Duke. So when people ask me, what do provosts do? I say, well, it's kind of like bringing severed heads to the Duke, but they're only figuratively severed, and the Duke is the president.
Okay, well, that's great. So you get involved in being a provost, and this actually kind of then puts you on a different career trajectory, because now you're actually, from being a teacher, professor, yes, you are now overseeing basically the entire university. And what's that like? I mean, my goodness. I mean, and do you enjoy doing this? Obviously, this is your third the Snow College is your third institution that you've done. Maybe talk about all the three that, so because you mentioned, okay, so you had, was it, you had the Evansville and
Newman University in Wichita, Kansas. And really, I wanted to go there because that was 2 hours away from my parents.
Oh, okay.
And that was a sort of a family move. And that was the only provost position I applied for. And I didn't expect to get it because I was still fairly young. I was still in my late 30s. And I didn't think I was quite ready for that. So it was sort of a trial balloon application. Mm-hmm. But it was a Catholic school. And I'd never worked with Catholic education before. And it was just fascinating. My best friend, the man who became my best friend, was a priest. Oh. I spent a lot of time in Catholic churches, meeting with bishops, working with diocesan school districts, setting up agreements. I oversaw a pastoral ministry program. It was a very Catholic school.
And just, I'm curious, when they say Catholic, like, was this a Jesuit school, or this had any affiliation, or was this just a general, it was affiliated with any particular?
It was affiliated with a fairly small order of sisters called the Adorers of the Blood of Christ.
Okay.
And it's an Italian order that also had one German branch. And that German branch was asked to send missionaries to Kansas when there were a lot of German speakers in Kansas who didn't have any education. And so that is where the Wichita branch of the Adorers of the Blood of Christ began. And they started the school in the 1930s. So it was very Catholic, but these were very, very politically progressive sisters.
Okay.
So they were, they were involved in opposing capital punishment, and they were involved in social justice issues. So having a Mormon provost wasn't a problem.
Okay, I was going to ask that. So there was no issue with you being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
No, they told me, because I even asked them that question. I asked one of the sisters that question. I said, is it a problem that I'm not a Catholic? And they said, no, we don't have a school to educate people because they're Catholic. We have a school to educate people because we're Catholic. And that's part of our mission. And we just want to find the best people. So there were no religious requirements for teaching, administering. The president had to be Catholic according to the Constitution. Nobody else had to be Catholic. And so they were very welcoming, and it was just a wonderful 8 years. And it was a small school with a small faculty. So it really was a good place to learn how to govern a university, and to broker consensus, to work within a shared governance model. And also, probably the most important thing I learned in that position was that you're not supposed to be comfortable all the time, and you succeed when you sort of learn how to adapt to a low level of constant discomfort, and you don't expect everyone to like you, because it won't happen. If you want perfection, you have to make everyone hate you.
Yep, that's true.
That's possible, but it's just not possible to please everybody. And that was a hard lesson to learn, because I like being liked, and I managed to go through being a department chair and a dean with pretty much everybody liking me. And I found as a provost that just wasn't going to happen.
Okay.
So I spent 8 years at a very Catholic school.
Right.
And then, for professional reasons, I went to a much higher rated school, the University of Evansville, which at the time was the 4th rated regional university in the Midwest.
Okay.
So it was just a professional move up. Larger faculty, larger budget, larger student population.
And this is a Methodist. This is a Methodist institution.
This is a Methodist institution.
Now, before we continue this, because this is a fascinating conversation, I always love these convergences between my world and your and the Restoration. That being, okay, one, you moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and lived in Oklahoma till you're 18. That's like the buckle of the Bible Belt. Then you take your first job in West Virginia, which is definitely full of a lot of Pentecostals and snake handling churches and evangelicals.
Well, Shepherdstown was really the extended DC metro area.
Oh, okay.
It was a bedroom community for Baltimore and Washington.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so it wasn't like Appalachia. Okay, but
it wasn't.
To me, I just want to hear about maybe growing up like in Oklahoma. And this is an evangelical world that you would have been in. Did you have any interactions with evangelicals growing up? Were they positive? Were they negative, or what? Tell me.
So I had a really good friend who was a Southern Baptist, and he invited me to go to a summer camp in Colorado. And they found out I was a Mormon, and I became a project. And that was kind of interesting. And I was heavily proselyted, and I ended up roommates with the pastor.
Oh, sure. That was not coincidental.
Yeah, wasn't coincidental. Um, every year or so, some church in our community showed the film The God Makers,
Sure.
and people would make comments to me at school. Oh yeah, yes, and that was a little bit uncomfortable. At the time, I imagined that I was being persecuted. Now, having seen actual persecution, I don't think I was being persecuted. I was being disagreed with, and I wrote a whole book about how we really ought to be able to disagree with each other better.
Yeah, that's kind of the theme of this channel, is try to
Yeah.
model the correct behavior of how we can have guests. I disagree with my guests 90% of the time, but guess what? They're treated fairly because they're fellow
Yeah.
image bearers, and we should look at them that way. So
We're
this
not
is,
supposed to agree all the time. We don't learn anything.
we don't. And actually, I love how you say the uncomfortability of of this tension there, which I think is a good thing, because I think, like I tell people, said I'm most comfortable in places where most people are uncomfortable. And I actually enjoy that tension because it keeps me sharp, man, and it keeps me on my toes. So I think that, you know, being in your comfort zone all the time kind of deadens you, and it actually kind of makes you goes you end up in a dead end. And I think
Well,
being in uncomfortable places, it keeps on challenging you. And actually, as somebody who's an academic who continues to want to learn, is still a student, if you will, those are probably good places to be.
and there's another factor here too, and I completely agree with you on that one. Not that I have to, but I do. But in academia, in many places, but it's particular in academia, there are certain people who are very good at making other people uncomfortable, and they usually end up having a completely disproportionate influence because people don't like to be uncomfortable, so they just give in. And I learned as a very young department chair that if you simply live with being uncomfortable, those people lose all of their power.
Okay.
Because they have no other power. Their power is that they can make people uncomfortable, and people don't like being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And if you just say, I'm just going to deal with being uncomfortable, their power disappears. And I've seen that happen over and over and over again.
Well, that's fast. That's an interesting observation. It's like you've learned so much about the human condition and how people are being in the position that you're in. And I'm glad you were learning these things, which, and then you can impart this wisdom to people as well, which I think is so cool. So now let's just get back. Now you're so now look now just background. So now you go to University of Evansville, which is a Methodist university. So this is the United Methodist Church, I'm assuming. Okay. And just to give you a little context, folks, the Methodist Church comes out of the Church of England. You had the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who started this movement of Bible study, and this they wanted to kind of be, they kind of were like the evangelicals, if you will, of the Church of England. And they were called Methodists because they were very methodical in their approach to studying scriptures and everything like that. So that's where the term, now also sometimes you'll hear the term Wesleyan. There's also a Wesleyan church. It also comes out of the holiness. You have the holiness Methodist movement, which later the Pentecostal movement would come out of. So it has a rich history in the Methodist Church here, especially in the United States. And let's keep in mind that Joseph Smith was a Methodist exhorter as a young boy, and that when the saints, most of the saints moved out west, Emma for a while actually went back to the Methodist Church, and as well. So Methodism plays a very important role within early Mormonism. So maybe I just wanted to give some context there. So now that's the University of Illinois of Evansville. Talk about that, and maybe comment on what I just said as well.
Yes, it was, I was very good friends with our pastor there, Tammy Gieselman. And the fact that our pastor, one of the elders of the church, was female was actually very strange for a Latter-day Saint, because we aren't, or even for a Catholic, that was not, we had sisters, but having an institution where women exercised a lot of ecclesiastical power was fascinating and wonderful. And Tammy just became one of my best friends, and still is. And she now is in charge of all United Methodist colleges. She's the United Methodist officer in charge of their college ministry. So So it was a different kind of spirituality, and I just really loved it. And I loved the Catholic spirituality. I love how people worship, and I love the ways that people have found to worship. One of the great things about being in Evansville is we live very close to a mosque, and we had a number of Muslim professors. And on most Fridays, I prayed at the mosque, and and got invited to all of the feasts during Ramadan, and really liked it. So I'm fascinated by the ways that people try to make sense of their role in the universe through religious ideas. And, I love them all. And I've really had so much experience with them all. I I stick with the Latter-day Saint position because that's my native language. It's just how I learned to ask these questions, and it gives me a vocabulary for asking these questions. But I don't have exclusive feelings about its absolute truth. I think if I had been born Muslim, I would be a Muslim asking these questions, because you need a vocabulary to have discussions, and Mormonism has given me that vocabulary, and that's why I stick with it. But I have tried to place Mormonism in context with other religious traditions in my own scholarship whenever possible.
It's interesting. I'm later this month, I'm probably going to be going to the local, it's not, they don't call it a temple, but I'm going to, for lack of a better term, to a Sikh temple. And I have a friend who's a Sikh, and he's invited me to attend their service. And one of the reasons I always wanted to go, has always been one of my bucket list items, is to attend a Sikh temple, is because I love that they give away free food to the home, to anybody who comes, and even lodging, that they'll let them sleep. I guess they'll even let them sleep in their temple. I think it's a beautiful a thing that a temple does, that is very involved in the community, and it feeds the poor. And I think that's a very Christ-like thing. So I'm going to volunteer in their kitchen to do that, which I think I'll be blessed by, and I hope to bless them as well. And I think it's really cool that you're the kind of person that would go to a mosque. I'm actually in charge of the Utah Interfaith Forum Facebook group. And as just so you know, this for the first time, I'll just say it here publicly. We are actually going to be launching a second channel called the Utah Interfaith Forum. And I won't be doing 3 episodes a week on that one, but I will probably do like a monthly episode, and probably have guest hosts as well from various religious traditions. So Michael, I think maybe you'd also make a good guest for my new channel, the Utah Interfaith Forum. We could talk about that experience as well, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. One of the books that we just published at BCC Press is Peggy Fletcher Stack and Kathleen Peterson's. I'm just going to get this.
Yeah, sure. So this is great. I love this.
This is the second edition of their book, The World of Faith.
Oh.
And it has entries on 30 different religious traditions that Peggy wrote, and artwork that Kathy did. I'll send you a copy of this.
Send me a copy, and let's get them both on my program. And what we could do is I could interview both of them and kind of launch the Utah Interfaith Forum on MBR, and maybe do a dual episode that way. I think that'd be great. So we're scheduling here on the fly, folks, which is what we do here. That would be great. I've been in touch with Peggy in the past, and I know she's expressed interest in doing something. So let's do something like that. So now, okay, so you're at a Methodist university. Just real quick, did you get any pushback for being a Latter-day Saint at all from the Methodists?
No, not a bit.
They're cool. All right. That is so
not
cool.
a bit. They're very ecumenical.
Yeah.
At least this university and this congregation were very ecumenical. So people didn't really understand Mormonism,
right?
But there was no pushback.
Okay. Well, I'm really actually glad to hear all this. These are good things to hear. Now, this is the thing. So now you how long were you at the University of Evansville?
7 years.
Okay, so that means you were a total of now 15 years as a provost between the two institutions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so now what made you decide that you wanted to now look back west, if you will, and find yourself back in Zion? What was the impetus for that?
So that's a really good question, and there are a lot of different answers. So I'll kind of go through them, but probably the most immediate thing was that my wife had asked me to find a position in Utah because her mother needs some help. Her mother's in a care center here, and she really wanted us to. Karen, my wife, really wanted to be able to interact with her mother and help support her mother, and so that was probably the overwhelming reason. A very important secondary reason is that over the years, just because of my own interests, my scholarship shifted from being about 1660 to 1700 British literature, that restoration, to being about Mormon literature. I became very active with the Association for Mormon Letters. I started publishing in 2014. This was my first book for a Latter-day Saint audience. And is that showing forward? Because it looks like it's backwards to me.
It's forward.
Okay.
It's mirrored on your end, but it's
then this book, which is a series of blog posts I wrote on my common consent, and both of these.
What's the name of that? What's the name of the book? What's the name of that book?
Buried Treasures.
Buried Treasures, and that's a series of essays based on the blogs that you had done.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Interesting.
And then this book, which is part of the University of Illinois Press's new Mormon Lives series, or Foundations of Mormon Thought series, is on really the first nationally recognized regional writer from the Mormon cultural region who had a Mormon background. And actually, all three of these books won awards from the Association for Mormon Letters, and I became increasingly invested in the Mormon studies scholarly community. And then I was the co-founder of BCC Press, which sells most of our books in Utah. So I was finding and I'm also on the board of directors of Dialogue.
Okay.
The Journal of Mormon Thought, the foundation, and was the chair of the board from 2019 through 2021. So I found myself flying to Utah 4 and 5 times a year.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
And so professionally, it just made sense for me to be here.
Okay. So then you're like, okay, so Zion's calling. You're going there, almost every other month. How did the Snow College thing get on your radar screen? Were you actively looking for opportunities in Utah, or did this just open up?
I was actively looking for opportunities in Utah. I had the higher education job search email alert whenever there was a provost or executive level position in Utah. Snow College is really a remarkable institution that I have known about for a long time. It's primarily a 2-year college, but it doesn't function like a standard community college. It's more like what used to be called a junior college. Most of its students transfer to 4-year institutions. The governor of Utah is an alum. A lot of BYU faculty are alums from Snow College. They start there. It has the lowest tuition rate in the state. It has been rated the #1 junior college for career preparation in the country. It is sort of at the forefront of access to higher education. And that's something that I'm very invested in. And that's something I couldn't do at a private university with $40,000 a year tuition.
Yeah.
I couldn't.
This is so this opportunity comes out to do this job, and it sounds like a remarkable institution. So when you got your email alert, this position was open, you were like, did you just jump right on? It's like, hey, this is the perfect for me? Okay. And so tell me the process. Did they how long did it take? So you put in your application and then you do interviews, maybe to describe the hiring process, how you got the job. And then also I want you to talk about your vision for Snow College. Now that you're the kind of, like you say, the provost is the inward looking, you're the one that's kind of really hands-on with the institution. So you, in many ways, can help shape its future. So talk about a little bit about how you got the job and then what your vision is for the future of Snow College.
So for any senior administrative position at a university, there's usually a three-tiered review process. So you submit an application, and if you are, they choose 8 to 12 people to interview on a Zoom call. So I did that. And then they choose 3 to 4 people to bring to campus for a campus interview. And then they make the final decision and hire the provost or the administrator from that pool. So it went very quickly. It took about 6 weeks.
Okay. Now this begs the question too. Did you get any pushback for being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here?
Well, it's a public institution, so
Right,
nobody could ask.
I could.
As it turns out, about 90% of our student body are Latter-day Saints.
Yeah.
But it is a public institution. You know, when I was in Wichita, I was actually a board member of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State.
Oh.
And we met in a Methodist church.
That's great.
So you know, I'm very aware of where the lines are, and I'm very committed to separation of church and state. So you know, nobody could ask. Now, anyone can just type my name into Google and figure out pretty quickly that I am a Latter-day Saint and that I do Mormon studies professionally. You know, that you can't hide a record like that anymore, like you could 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But it can't come up. I mean, it would be illegal for that.
Right, of course. So I'm very curious now. Of course, just real quick before we talk about your vision for the future of Snow College, where did Snow College get its name?
So Snow College, this is actually very interesting. It was originally the San Pete Stake Academy, and it was one of about 40 stake level high schools that were started in the 19th century when there were not enough public high schools to educate the population of Utah. They wanted to name themselves Snow College after Lorenzo Snow, who was the 5th president of the church after Wilford Woodruff. And Lorenzo Snow said he wasn't comfortable having the college named after him, but he would be okay if they called it Snow College equally after him and his cousin Erastus Snow, who was also one of the early apostles. So Snow College is named jointly for Lorenzo and Erastus Snow. We have the room right across the hall from me is called the Lorenzo and Erastus room.
Oh, wow.
And in the early 1930s, most of these academies were either closed or handed over to the state.
Yeah, so, and just so you know, I had Casey Griffiths on a couple of years ago to talk about Joseph Merrill, who was kind of involved in that whole process, as I recall.
Yes, yeah, he was a spearhead there. So, you know, BYU was the Provost Stake Academy. Ensign College was the Salt Lake Academy. Ricks College was the Stake Academy. Dixie, which became Utah Tech, was a stake academy. Snow was a stake academy. So these were all these colleges. Weber was a stake academy. So these all started as stake level high schools, and they grew into colleges.
Some grew into church schools, and some grew into state schools.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
So now this is a very unique institution with a very fascinating history. And of course, you of course are somebody who is really plugged into history and the past and everything like that, and respectful of it. But my question for you is, what is your vision for the future of Snow College?
So Snow College is in a unique position right now to increase access to education in the state of Utah. I mean, we have a very, very reasonable tuition. We have a lot of professional programs. We have a lot of more academic programs. So my vision really involves, I believe, and this is just, you know, I believe, and I can, you know, quite a bit of data suggests that we desperately need to increase college graduation rates in this country. And in the state, we don't have enough college graduates in this country to do the amount of work that requires a college degree. So I think that educational access is the most important thing that we can do right now. And I think that Snow is best positioned, the best institution in the state of Utah to meaningfully increase access to people who would not otherwise have access to college.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. And now also you guys have expanded to offer some bachelor degrees, right? Is that correct?
There are 2 bachelor's degrees at Snow. The bachelor's degree in music production, commercial music, and a bachelor's degree in software engineering.
So now you had mentioned the importance of increasing, having more college graduates and making it more accessible for people. I just want you, what are your thoughts on the announcement recently that I believe BYU Idaho and I think Ensign College are going to be offering 3-year degrees, full, like it's a degree, but it just takes 3 years to complete. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think you might model some of that as well?
I'm not sure where we're going to go with that yet. That was just approved by the Northwest Accrediting Association, the Northwest Association of Colleges and Schools, and I have not. I'm giving a bureaucratic answer here. I'm not in a position to talk about that yet because I just haven't seen what the requirements are, what the limits to this are. It's an interesting proposition, and it's one that is certainly how most European institutions are 3-year degrees. So it's something that I'm interested in looking at, but I don't know enough about the requirements.
Okay, well, that's just
the
a new thing.
accreditation requirements.
I wouldn't blame you for not knowing a whole lot about that. It's a relatively new thing, but it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, and maybe it could be the future of higher education.
And it's not, the 3-year degree is not new. A lot of institutions offer 3-year degrees. What's new is a 90 credit hour degree.
Okay.
You know, most universities still offer 120 hours, but they find ways to cram that into 3 years.
Okay.
And that's been going on for quite some time.
Okay.
The 90 credit hour degree is the game changer.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that's interesting to me. Okay, so now there's a few things happening here that in regards to oh, by the way, is there anything else you wanted to say about Snow College?
No.
Okay, so you're going to be presenting this. I'm taping this the Wednesday before this weekend, which is going to be the Book of Mormon Studies Association, and you're going to be presenting there. And this morning, I had an opportunity to read your paper that you'll be presenting, and I found it to be really fascinating. I just want you to briefly describe, first of all, what the Book of Mormon Studies Association is and what your paper is about, and then I also want you to talk about your book that's coming out this January.
So the BOMSA, the Book of Mormon Studies Association, is a professional society of Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint scholars and formerly Latter-day Saint scholars who all find the Book of Mormon worthy of academic study, you know, as a historical artifact or as a literary artifact. And I come from the literary artifact position. But this is a group of people who write and publish scholarship about the Book of Mormon. And we're really in the golden age of Book of Mormon scholarship right now. Grant Hardy, Jared Hickman, John Thomas, who's a Pentecostal, Elizabeth Fenton, who is not a Latter-day Saint, but very serious scholars are writing very serious books and articles about the Book of Mormon. And this, the Book of Mormon Studies Association was meant to foster this scholarship. So I've never been before. This will be my first meeting of the Book of Mormon Studies Association. It's in Logan, Utah, on the Utah State campus. The paper that I'm going to give is just sort of a condensation. It's condensing of the book that I will be publishing with University of Illinois Press in January. And it's about how the Book of Mormon reads the Bible, which is called The Testimony of Two Nations, How the Book of Mormon Reads and Rereads the Bible. And my argument is that Book of Mormon studies still has a context problem. There's not an easy way, and this is especially for literary studies. Literary studies require some kind of context. Minimally, it's good to know, who wrote a book, when they lived, what language they originally wrote it in. Those are just your core foundational questions for literary studies. And they're usually pretty easy to answer. Charles Dickens wrote A Tale of Two Cities in England in the 19th century. He wrote it in English. I mean, those are non-controversial issues. With the Book of Mormon, they're tremendously controversial issues. Every one of those core context questions is hotly debated. So, there are some people who write Book of Mormon studies using an ancient context, saying this is a Hebraic document written in Inca, Mayan, early America. And they use that context to look at what other things were written. What kinds of questions do you ask the text, and that the context makes that difference. A lot of people use a 19th century American context. This was a book that was written in English in the 19th century. A lot of scholars who want to talk to both groups use a maneuver called bracketing, which is really just a version of what literary critics would call phenomenology, where you simply bracket the question of origins, and you say, here's the text as a historical document, and let's study what we can study about it without asking these context questions. So those have been the three primary ways that literary scholars and theological scholars have situated the Book of Mormon in a context. What I'm trying to do in this book is to use a different context, and that is the context of the canon in which the Book of Mormon exists and which it creates. And so I'm drawing a lot on the work of the Protestant theologian and Yale professor Reverend Childs, who said that the most important version of any text is the final version, the final form, the version that is used in the religious communities that build their lives around it.
Mm-hmm.
And the way to study the context that matters most for the Old Testament is the canon of the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to understand the Old Testament, you have to understand, if you're going to understand it in a Christian context, which is the only way to understand the Old Testament, because outside of a Christian context, it's the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. It's not the Old Testament. So to understand the Old Testament, you have to understand it within the context of this canon that was created when the New Testament mapped itself onto the Old Testament and created the connections. So I'm arguing here that one of the best ways to situate the Book of Mormon in a context is to situate it in the canonical context, which means within the context of the Bible, Book of Mormon canon that is created when the Book of Mormon maps itself onto the Bible, which is actually a very similar process to the way that the writers of the New Testament map themselves on to the Hebrew Bible.
Yep. And
that's a very short way of explaining what the book is about.
Yeah, it really, and of course, this is just an intro and of course, what is the name? What's going to be the name of the book again? In coming out,
The Testimony of Two Nations: How the Book of Mormon reads and rereads the Bible.
Okay, I love that. And I often think, so often evangelicals will criticize the Book of Mormon. Or claims made by the Book of Mormon when they're saying like the stick of Joseph and the stick of Ephraim, and they're like, well, no, it really means this and this, and no, they're taking it out of the context. And then I'm thinking, yeah, but think of all the Jews, how they see how we in the New Testament kind of misquote the Old Testament as well.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that too. Like Alma is not a virgin. Alma is a young woman in Isaiah, and yet. So I've watched many rabbis to talk about hey the Christian, why do they keep misquoting the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament? And so I think it's really actually kind of a cool thing in one sense that the Book of Mormon, the same accusation that evangelicals or Christians would hurl against the Book of Mormon, is the exact same accusation that the Jews would hurl towards the New Testament.
Well, and we're dealing with three separate canons.
Yes,
and that's crucial. We're not dealing with one canon that keeps expanding. The New Testament makes sense within the context of the canon of the Old and New Testaments, or the Christian Bible.
Right.
If you take it out of that canon, it doesn't make sense. If you judge it just by the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't make sense. I think that a lot of evangelicals and other people who criticize the Book of Mormon are saying the Book of Mormon doesn't make sense within the Christian canon, which is absolutely correct. It does not make sense within the Christian canon. It makes perfect sense within the Restoration canon, the Bible, Book of Mormon canon, and a few of the other Restoration scriptures, which are a little bit tricky because different Restoration denominations recognize different other scriptures.
Yep.
But the Bible and the Book of Mormon together form a Restoration canon that makes sense within its own context. But if you try to evaluate it by just the Christian Bible context, that canonical context, it won't make sense anymore. And if you try to evaluate the New Testament by just the Hebrew Bible context, it won't make sense.
I think that's really a great and unique and interesting approach that you're taking there. I really enjoyed the paper that you sent me. I appreciate it. For those of you, if this airs before this weekend in Logan, Utah State, right? Is that the
Utah State? Yes.
Yeah, Utah State. And we want to give a shout out to our friend. What's the who's hosting it?
John Christopher. Oh, Patrick Mason.
Yeah, Patrick. I can't believe I don't know why that slipped my mind. My good friend Patrick Mason has been so kind enough to open up the university every year to BAMSA. Give you a shout out. Patrick, we'll have you on the program soon. I know we've been in touch. And I'm very excited about this weekend. I wish I was there. That's part of the reason why Zion keeps calling me too, man. And maybe I'll end up following your lead and move out there at some point as well. Michael Austin, you are a really cool human being. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
So, folks, I want to hear what you have to say about this. I'd like to get your comments about this. Also, I'm going to have Michael send me links to a lot of the books that he described, and I'll make sure that those are put in the description. Also in the description, don't forget to, 1, enter the book contest, 2, go to MormonBookReviews.com, where we have our merch store, where we have hats, and we have coffee mugs, or excuse me, hot chocolate mugs, and we have other items that you could purchase to help support the channel. Also, go to Patreon. We have links to Patreon, PayPal, and Venmo for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. And I want to thank all of you who are financially supporting the channel. Just picked up 2 new Patreons this past week. Thank you. Thank you. Couldn't do it without you. It funds my trips. It funds the ability to upgrade equipment and everything like that. I'm very grateful to my financial backers and supporters. But remember, this is the most important thing is this. Remember, all the voices of the Restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.